What happened behind the controversies and headlines that still follow Jan Stephenson at 73? This is an exclusive look into the life of this golf icon who stirred global headlines. From her record-breaking wins to a controversial photo shoot that shook the LPGA. Get ready for a story that shook up the world of golf. With insights from Golf Digest and ESPN, we're breaking down how she made people pay attention. Stay with us to the end to see how her legacy at 73 is no longer about controversy. Let me first show you what made Jan Stephenson stand out long before she went pro. Jan Stephenson was born in Sydney, Australia in 1951, and from a very young age, it was clear she had something special. While most kids were figuring out what they liked to do, Jan was already mastering the golf course. By the time she was 16, she had won the New South Wales Junior Championship, a major tournament in her home country. Her swing was smooth, her focus was intense, and she had a hunger to compete that set her apart. People noticed. Coaches, fans, and reporters all began paying attention to the teen from down under who was showing up the adults. Jan's talent wasn't just raw, it was backed up by hard work and dedication. She practiced constantly, studying the game with a level of seriousness that even older players respected. As she continued to win tournaments and prove herself against strong competition, her path became clear. If she wanted to reach the top, she had to go where the best women golfers played, the United States. She moved to the US in the early 1970s to chase that dream, and in 1974, she officially joined the LPGA Tour. That year, she burst onto the scene, winning the LPGA Rookie of the Year award. It was a sign of things to come. Over her career, she would win 16 times on the LPGA Tour and secure 3 major championships: the 1981 Peter Jackson Classic, the 1982 LPGA Championship, and the 1983 US Women's Open. She didn't just play the game well, she made it exciting to watch. But Jan was more than just a winner. She had a presence. Her confidence showed in every swing, every stare down the fairway, and every post-round interview. She had a certain flair, a mix of beauty, charm, and a calm but determined energy that made her magnetic to fans and media alike. Sponsors loved her look, the cameras loved her style, and audiences couldn't look away. At a time when women's golf didn't get much attention, Jan stood out like a spark in the dark. What made her unique wasn't just the trophies, it was how she carried herself. She didn't shy away from the spotlight. While other players focused strictly on the game, Jan embraced the attention. She posed for photos, spoke openly with reporters, and understood that being a public figure could help grow the sport she loved. Her boldness was refreshing to some and controversial to others, but either way, it made her unforgettable. That bold spirit would later become a source of tension and debate. But in these early years, Jan Stephenson was a rising star who played with heart, stood with confidence, and gave women's golf a face the world couldn't ignore. She wasn't just making history, she was starting a conversation that still echoes decades later. Before we go further, let's talk about the photo shoot that made everyone notice Jan Stephenson. In the early 1980s, Jan Stephenson made a move that no one in the golf world saw coming. She agreed to do a bold photo shoot that would soon become one of the most talked about moments in the history of women's golf. The most striking image? Jan, completely nude, sitting in a bathtub filled with golf balls. It was sexy, eye-catching, and unlike anything the sport had ever seen. But more than that, it was a calculated decision. Jan understood the power of the media, and she was ready to use it. At the time, women's golf was struggling to get the spotlight. The LPGA Tour lacked the television deals, sponsorships, and audience numbers that the men's PGA Tour enjoyed. Jan saw an opening. She believed that if she could grab public attention, maybe the whole tour would benefit. And she wasn't wrong. That photo spread landed her on magazine covers, late-night talk shows, and news programs across the world. For the first time in a long time, people were talking about women's golf, and they weren't just talking about the scores. The LPGA itself leaned into the moment. The organization, hungry for growth, began positioning Jan as a kind of marketing figurehead, someone who could represent both athletic excellence and star power. Promotional campaigns highlighted her looks and glamour alongside her golf stats. They believed that she could draw in new fans, especially men who might not have tuned in otherwise. It was a shift in strategy, and Jan was at the center of it. But not everyone was thrilled. Many of Jan's fellow players were uncomfortable with the new direction. Some felt she was using sex appeal in a way that undercut the seriousness of the sport. They worried that it made it harder for women golfers to be respected for their skills. Critics, both inside and outside of golf, accused her of cheapening the game. But Jan pushed back. Again and again, she said it was her body, her choice, and her career. She believed she was helping the sport by making it more visible, and in many ways, she was right. The public reaction was split. Some praised her as a trailblazer, a woman who owned her image and didn't let anyone box her in. Others felt she was playing into outdated stereotypes, using beauty instead of ability to get ahead. This moment became more than just a media story. It became part of a larger debate about how women were treated in sports, how they were marketed, and who got to decide how they should look or act. Even now, decades later, the photos from that time still pop up in discussions about gender in sports. The bathtub photo has become an icon, symbolizing both the attention Jan brought to the LPGA and the tough questions she forced people to ask. Was she breaking barriers or crossing a line? That depends on who you ask. But one thing is clear, Jan Stephenson made people look. And once they were looking, she made sure they saw the game. Stick around, because what she's remembered for today is far bigger than the headlines that once followed her. You don't want to miss how it all turns around. Up next, she made headlines in history. But how did Jan handle being shut out behind the scenes? The wave of attention Jan Stephenson received from her provocative photo shoots brought her global fame, but it also unleashed a storm she couldn't fully control. What began as a bold move to shine a spotlight on women's golf quickly turned into a media frenzy that blurred the lines between sport and spectacle. For every headline and endorsement that came her way, there was growing tension behind the scenes. Inside the LPGA, discomfort simmered. Veteran players began to speak out, not just in interviews, but in private meetings and locker room conversations. Some of Jan's closest peers now kept their distance. The camaraderie that once bonded competitors began to unravel. Whispers turned into judgment. Some accused her of chasing headlines at the expense of the game's credibility, saying she cared more about magazine covers than tournament finishes. Others felt betrayed, that a sport they'd worked so hard to legitimize was now being reduced to photo ops and publicity stunts. It didn't help that Jan had become a lightning rod in the media. Her face was everywhere, from golf publications to lifestyle magazines and late-night talk shows. She was invited to red carpets, brand launches, and celebrity events. While many casual fans were newly interested in women's golf because of her visibility, longtime followers of the sport were divided. Was Jan a breath of fresh air, or was she turning golf into something unrecognizable? The LPGA leadership itself was stuck in the middle. Some quietly supported Jan behind closed doors, recognizing the buzz she generated and the sponsors she brought in. Others grew uneasy. They worried that the sport's identity was slipping out of their control, that its future was being shaped more by personality than by performance. Tensions within the organization grew. Some meetings turned into debates over dress codes, media appearances, and what professionalism should look like on and off the course. Even the business world was split. Beauty brands and lifestyle companies couldn't get enough of Jan's crossover appeal. She wasn't just a golfer anymore, she was a celebrity. And with celebrity came product deals, brand endorsements, and press coverage far beyond the sports pages. But not all sponsors were on board. Conservative companies that had long supported the LPGA began to pull back. Some backed out of deals altogether. Others demanded stricter promotional guidelines or more control over how players were presented. For tournament organizers, Jan became a double-edged sword. She brought crowds, media crews, and ratings, but she also brought controversy. Every time her name was on the roster, they had to ask themselves, will the attention be good or too much? And yet, through it all, Jan never wavered. In press interviews, she stood her ground. She didn't apologize. She didn't backpedal. "I don't regret it. It helped the tour," she famously said in 1987. And looking at the numbers, she wasn't wrong. TV ratings for LPGA events had improved. Attendance was up. Younger audiences were tuning in. New sponsorships were in play. She had brought women's golf into a broader cultural conversation, one that extended far beyond scorecards and tee times. But the emotional cost? That's the part rarely seen. Behind the glamour and media attention, Jan admitted to feeling isolated. Some players snubbed her in locker rooms. Others excluded her from practice rounds or refused to speak to her on tour. She was often left out of committee meetings, informal gatherings, and leadership discussions. The message was clear. Her presence was welcome on billboards, but not always in the clubhouse. The emotional toll of being judged, not for her swing, but for her image, was heavy. She carried the weight of being both admired and dismissed, praised by fans and questioned by peers. But instead of folding, Jan leaned in. She owned the brand she had built, flaws and all. She embraced the tension. If the game wasn't going to make space for women who were bold, beautiful, and unafraid, then she would make that space herself. By this point, Jan Stephenson's legacy had taken on a new shape. She was no longer just a player racking up titles, she was a symbol. Her name now lived in conversations about gender, appearance, power, and permission. Could a woman be strong and sexy? Could she market herself without selling out? Was it possible to fight for visibility without being accused of vanity? Whether you saw her as a role model or a cautionary tale, one thing was undeniable. Jan Stephenson had changed the game. And even if she had to pay the price alone, she never stopped believing it was worth it. Now that we've seen her fight for visibility in golf, how did she handle fighting for her beliefs? Jan Stephenson had never been afraid to speak her mind. But in 2003, her words took on a different kind of weight. This time not about golf, but about America, politics, and identity. In a televised interview shortly after the 9/11 attacks, she commented on immigration and cultural assimilation, saying, "This is America. Speak English." The quote spread like wildfire. It struck a nerve. To some, it sounded like tough love. To others, it sounded like bigotry. The timing couldn't have been more sensitive. The United States was still reeling from the tragedy of 9/11. National security, patriotism, and what it meant to be American were hot-button issues. In that climate, her comments were seen by many as offensive, especially toward immigrants and non-native English speakers. Major media outlets picked up the story, and the backlash came fast. Headlines accused her of being out of touch. Commentators questioned why a sports figure, especially one born in Australia, felt entitled to dictate American values. Civil rights organizations and advocacy groups were quick to respond. Statements were issued condemning her words as xenophobic and damaging to the ongoing effort to promote inclusivity in sports and society at large. Several sponsors reportedly distanced themselves from her brand in the weeks and months that followed. While some of those moves were quiet, the message was loud. Jan had crossed a line, and now she was paying the price. But she also had defenders. Many people, especially those who shared her conservative views, felt that Jan was simply saying what others were thinking. They saw her as brave, someone who stood firm in her beliefs at a time when public figures were expected to stay politically neutral. To them, her remarks were about preserving culture and unity, not spreading hate. Her fans praised her honesty, even if they didn't agree with her tone. This moment in Jan's life sparked a broader debate. Should athletes speak out about political and cultural issues? And if they do, should they be held to different standards than the rest of us? Jan wasn't the first athlete to step into the political arena, but her comments were among the most polarizing. The incident highlighted just how tricky it can be when public figures mix personal beliefs with public platforms. For Jan, this chapter solidified her place as someone who would never play it safe. Once again, she was at the center of controversy, and once again, she didn't back down or issue a soft apology. Her stance didn't just reshape how people viewed her, it changed her role in the public eye. She was no longer only a golfer or a celebrity. She had become something else entirely, a cultural lightning rod. To this day, those few words from that 2003 interview remain among the most controversial in her career. But they also mark a major turning point, when Jan Stephenson stopped being seen solely as a sports icon and started being recognized as a fiercely outspoken public figure, unafraid to challenge the norms of silence and neutrality in fame. Can't wait to see how it all adds up? We're almost there, and trust me, Jan's legacy at 73 is worth the wait. Now, how did Jan turn controversy into creativity and launch an unexpected wine empire? By the early 2000s, Jan Stephenson had stepped away from the grind of full-time professional golf. But true to her nature, she wasn't ready to disappear quietly. Retirement from competition opened a new chapter in her life, one defined by reinvention, entrepreneurship, and giving back. No longer bound to the tee box, Jan pivoted with purpose, applying her drive and creativity to new ventures off the course. One of her most notable moves was the launch of Jan Stephenson Wines, a boutique label that reflected her taste, lifestyle, and international appeal. The wine business wasn't just a side project, it became a brand extension that gained traction in both the US and Australia. The label leaned into her reputation for elegance and boldness, with blends that carried her name and flair. Like her golf game, her wine brand was strategic, polished, and a little daring. But wine wasn't the only place Jan left her mark. She also moved into golf course design, bringing her playing experience and eye for detail into course layouts. Her designs emphasized what made her a great player: risk-reward strategy, thoughtful pacing, and visual beauty. Each project gave her another way to shape the game she loved, this time from the other side of the green. Her courses were praised for their creativity and balance, reflecting her deep understanding of golf's rhythm and psychology. In 2019, decades after her controversial rise to fame, the LPGA gave Jan the formal recognition that had long eluded her: induction into the World Golf Hall of Fame. The honor was a full-circle moment. For years, she had been seen as divisive, someone who brought as much drama as she did talent. But this moment reframed her legacy. It was a public acknowledgement not just of her wins, but of the role she played in shaping women's golf, through skill, innovation, and unshakable vision. Fans and fellow players applauded her as a pioneer who had changed the game, even if it took time for the sport to catch up. Perhaps the most meaningful work of Jan's later years, though, has been her philanthropic efforts for U.S. veterans. Through the Jan Stephenson Foundation, she launched programs that use golf to aid the physical and emotional recovery of wounded service members. These programs offer community, movement, and healing in a way that few sports can. Her foundation has earned accolades from veterans groups and recognition from government leaders. It's a quiet kind of impact, but one that's deeply personal and lasting. This phase of Jan's life has revealed a different side of her, a woman still as bold as ever, but softer in her mission. After decades of fighting to be seen, heard, and respected, she chose to spend her energy lifting others. Her strength never faded, it simply evolved. She remains outspoken, yes, but now her words are in service of causes she believes in, not just her own defense. Her later years have brought her something that often eluded her in her prime: peace. Peace in her work, in her legacy, and in how she is remembered. Jan Stephenson, once the sport's most controversial figure, found a way to turn that fire into something generous and enduring. And for many, that transformation is just as inspiring as anything she did on the fairway. Finally, this is the moment you've been waiting for. What makes Jan's legacy more powerful than ever at 73? At 73, Jan Stephenson's name still stirs debate, and that's exactly why her story matters. She wasn't the most dominant player of her time, but she was one of the most unforgettable. Her legacy doesn't rest on trophies alone, it's about how she reshaped the way people saw women in sports. Looking back now, Jan wasn't just part of the LPGA Tour. She was a disruptor, a brand builder, and a conversation starter in an era that wasn't ready for any of it. In today's world, athletes are celebrated not just for their skills, but for their personalities, their style, and their voice. We see stars across sports using social media, fashion, and advocacy to build brands. Jan did all of that before it was common. She challenged the mold of what a female athlete should be. She wasn't afraid to mix power with beauty, strength with vulnerability, and performance with personality. For every person who judged her, there were just as many who quietly watched and realized they didn't have to follow the rules either. Her story now reads like a blueprint, one filled with the risks and rewards of pushing boundaries. She was called brave, arrogant, glamorous, polarizing, often all in the same sentence. And in a way, that sums her up perfectly. Jan lived in the gray area of sports culture where you can be both praised and punished for standing out. She didn't walk a straight line, she carved out a path of her own. Over the decades, the world has changed, so has the sports industry. The conversation around gender, image, and power is more open now. But in many ways, Jan had those conversations before they were cool, before there were platforms to support them. She lived through the pushback in real time, without the social media support networks or brands pushing diversity campaigns. What she did then would probably be celebrated today, but back then, she was often alone. And that's what makes her legacy so complex and so powerful. She wasn't perfect. She made mistakes, said things that sparked outrage, and took risks that sometimes backfired. But she never quit. She kept evolving, kept creating, and kept showing up. Whether designing golf courses, supporting wounded veterans, or receiving one of golf's highest honors, Jan always did things her way. At 73, her story isn't about scandal, it's about staying power. It's a reminder that change is never comfortable, that visibility comes at a cost, and that being remembered often requires being misunderstood. Jan Stephenson didn't just play golf, she played the long game, and in the end, her boldness forced the sport to grow up a little. We hope you enjoyed uncovering the untold story of Jan Stephenson, her rise, her risks, and the legacy she built against the odds. Her journey shows us what it really means to stand out, stay true, and shake up an entire sport. There's more where this came from. Watch the next videos to keep diving into the lives of the world's most unforgettable stars.